Nobody thought a dead car battery would be the beginning of everything. Jacob did not see beginnings. He saw endings, of patience, of small allowances, of months of rice gone thin. He saw the slow erosion of a life held together by borrowed time. His hands remembered the precise smell of diesel and metal before they remembered his children's faces, the smell of the workshop clinging to his skin, the stubborn black under his fingernails that soak could rarely dislodge. On most mornings, the Lego sun hit the corrugated roofs and turned the city into a sheet of metal. The heat made men squint and think only of water. Jacob moved through that heat with a mechanic's concentration. A problem, a fix, another problem. The work was honest, the pay thin, and there was always a new debt that looked like a rooster waiting to peck his savings. At home, the one-room, corrugated-roof house the bank would never notice, Miriam's temper held the household in line the way the city's electricity held together a movie theater's projector. She was young for her measured fury, 41, shoulders square, the kind of woman who carried pride like a well-cut wrapper. She had been proud the day their daughter Helen was born, when they found a way to feed and clothe the child and still sleep. Now that pride had a cost. Helen was 8 and had a cough that made Jacob wake in the night with fear he could not buy medicine for. She also had a school note, crisp and official, that described unpaid fees in a tone that assumed shame belonged to the poor. "You see this?" Miriam said the morning the battery died, tapping the note with the sort of precise anger people learn when they are hungry. "They will send her home, again." Jacob had 2 options: look for more work, which was the same as looking for coins inside spilled rice, or take jobs that smelled of risk. He chose work. He lubricated the rhythm of a life held in small gears. That morning it was heat and oil, and the sound of a radio somewhere playing a hymn half forgotten. He was leaning under a rusted Toyota when a Mercedes engine coughed in the lane and stopped. The driver's window lowered just enough for the sun to glance off a gold card on the dashboard. A woman got out. She was not the kind of woman he expected to meet at the mechanics on Illapigi Road. She wore a white scarf, folded with deliberate care, sunglasses like a small eclipse, and gloves that did not carry the memory of working hands. Her shoes did not know Lego scutters. The Mercedes carried a hush like a house that has been well insured against surprise. Jacob finished with the Toyota and walked over, wiping his hands on a rag that carried other men's grease. He had a habit of looking people in the face long enough to measure their need. This woman's face was older than her hands, and it carried a peculiar kind of loneliness. She introduced herself, Amanda Okoro, and when she spoke, the voice suggested wealth had softened her edges.
She laughed once, as if laughing could reset a clock. "It's a dead battery, sir?" she asked. "Yes, madam. I can jumpstart for now, or replace." She watched him work with a kind of attention that made a man feel seen in a way money alone did not buy. When the engine shuddered to life and the Mercedes purred, she opened the glove box and took out a business card stamped in gold leaf, Amanda Okoro, Okoro Group. She extended it to him like an offering, and then, almost without thinking, folded a banknote into his hand. It was more than he expected, 200,000 naira, folded with the crispness of fresh paper. Jacob blinked. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved me time." A gratitude that came with currency has a different weight. For Jacob, 200,000 naira could cover Helen's school fees and a half year of rationed rice. For Amanda, it was a momentary annoyance that someone had let her down and a courtesy rendered back into the world. The exchange changed nothing in the ledger of Lagos, but it altered the shape of Jacob's days. He held the card, the business, and the name like a thread that wrapped around an open door. After she drove away, Jacob went home lighter, if only in the short arithmetic of bills. He told Miriam the truth in the way small lies sometimes feel. He had been paid more than a tip. Miriam's eyes were a geography of suspicion and hunger. "Where did you meet such a woman?" she asked. She did not disbelieve the story. She could not afford to. "Her car died near the junction. She gave me this." He showed the card with a sort of embarrassed pride. "She said to call if I ever needed work." Miriam held the card as if it were a coin she could inspect for guarantee. Pride fluctuates when it is touched by paper. Miriam's thumb ran over Amanda's gold letters as if they might rub off onto her skin and make her life smoother. That night, Jacob fed Helen and tucked her in with a promise to find ways. He slept on the rooftop, where the city breathed, and the distant hum of traffic was a lullaby and a threat. The card did not leave Jacob alone. Calls came over the next days, a flat voice at first, concerned, almost clinical, then another, warmer. "Jacob, it's Amanda. I wanted to thank you again. Would you mind coming by my house tomorrow? I'd like to speak to you." Jacob's heart beat a crooked drum. He told Miriam. She frowned the way a mother keeps the household's axis from tipping. "Work is work," she said. "You go, but you tell me everything." He went. The Okoro house was a place that wanted to be a small country. Marble floors reflected the sun with a hardness that made Jacob feel like he was walking across thought. The walls were lined with art, landscapes that had been bought and framed by people who never expected repair. Amanda's driver, Alhaji Musa, waited in the shade, linen hat folded back. He greeted Jacob with the small dignity of a man in a long service job who had seen all sorts of human error and fortune.
Inside, Amanda poured tea. Not the strong, burnt tea Jacob knew from makeshift roadside stalls, but tea that tasted of leaves that had crossed oceans. She listened to Jacob talk about his children, about a leaking roof, about the expense of school books and the clucking of the local landlords. She did not offer platitudes, she offered money. It felt like a breeze that unhooked something tight inside him. Over the next weeks, the infrequent calls became a sort of scaffolding. Amanda would ask after Helen's cough, then call after the power went out in Jacob's street, sending a message of concern that was almost tender. Her wealth allowed her a kind of generosity that looked like miracle when it landed in Jacob's hands. She paid a plumber for Miriam's leaking pipe and wired money that took the immediate edge off a bill. The amounts were never mentioned in a way meant to shame. They arrived as solutions. 200,000 became 500,000, then a million. Numbers in naira that seemed ludicrous in Jacob's life became lifelines. Jacob told himself these things were transaction and relief, and he believed it when he said it to Miriam. She watched him shift under the light of the fan in their dark room, the gaze that had loved him at 25, now sharpened by the arithmetic of survival. Her pride bristled. She suspected, then wondered, then guarded like a wolf. Miriam's suspicions were not only about money. She watched Jacob's phone for a tone that was both familiar and dangerous. Amanda, for her part, had reasons beyond benevolence. She was 65 and had lived most of her adult life with the absence of a child like an ache. She had been married twice. Both unions had the quiet end of imperceptible departures. The second husband had left their bed colder than the first, and medical verdicts had once drawn a boundary around the possibility of children. Her world had been orders and boardrooms, strategic acquisitions, and a house that was a museum of things bought to keep spaces from feeling too empty. The arrival of a helper, someone who could fix a battery, who could listen, who did not immediately see her as a trophy, unsettled her. It was not just gratitude. It was, she found in that smaller voice inside that had not been allowed to speak in meetings, companionship. In private, she admitted it as the thing old women often confide in the mirror. It was the look in Jacob's eyes, the way he would pause before speaking as if asking permission to belong to a life that was not his. He was not a prince. He was a man with calloused palms and a slow laugh and a family that kept him in the real weight of the world. But his presence, repeated, made a lonely house a place where someone had once said good morning and meant it not out of duty. Amaka noticed before she should have. Amaka, Amanda's twin, lived like a shadow in the house and like a presence born to be heard.
Where Amanda saw possibilities and cold houses, Amaka saw dependency as entitlement. She had built a life around living off her sister's success, grandchildren imagined, small comforts, the kind of daily expenses one calls gift until habit erases the word that once named it as a favor. Amaka had two sons, Emma and Chisholm, who clung to the house's charity the way a vine clings to a wall. They did not work the way Jacob worked. Their labor was a soft skill, calls, small errands, the performance of needing. Amaka's voice was always 2 decibels louder than the room required. She liked to point at things with the fretful anger of someone affronted by the thought of her own dignity being tied to someone else's wallet. When Jacob first came to the house, she watched him with eyes that counted the ways his shoes did not match his hands. Her contempt was not only for class, it was for risk. The appearance of proximity threatened the order she had arranged around herself. "You must be careful," she told Amanda at dinner one night, stirring her soup with a spoon like a slow accusation. "He is a mechanic. They all think their work gives them rights." Amanda watched her twin with a patient sorrow. "He helped with my car," she said. "He only did what he is paid to do." "But paid more than he should be," Amaka said. We cannot allow people to think wealth is an open tap, Amanda. There was a truth in Amaka's words. The house's generosity had become a stream that fed others, and with every outsider who drank, there was a marginal possibility of an erosion in her own security. This insecurity was not pure greed. Amaka had fears. She had built a life predicated on a sister's kindness and knew how fragile that relied upon kindness could be. She feared being pushed aside one day, humiliated in a will or a cold boardroom conversation. She feared the child that might change legal standing and priority. If Amanda had a child at 65, what would that mean for Amaka's claim? Amaka felt, with the logic of a person who had practiced dependence for years, that she had an investment at risk. Jacob, meanwhile, stepped into a space that belonged to neither world. He accepted small jobs at the Okoro house, fixing a cabinet hinge, adjusting a garage door, checking the Mercedes battery when it coughed again. He touched marble with oil-stained fingers and tried to keep a posture that made him seem less small. Amanda invited him to sit with tea. She wanted talk. She wanted stories of Lagos neighborhoods. He told her about Helen's class play and how she had memorized lines with a solemnness that made Jacob proud in a way money had not. The exchanges grew less guarded. Late-night phone calls bloomed into confessions about loneliness. Amanda spoke about long evenings in a house that was too quiet, about the ache that came with boardroom victories that could not be placed in a child's palm.
Jacob spoke about the irritation of a landlord who had promised to be gentle and then come knocking with a list of demands. Their conversations crossed the line that separates charity from closeness. He found himself dialing when the workshop had no work, and she found a voice in him that did not make her feel like an investor or a case study. One night, after a fundraiser that had left the house pulsing with people who made generous noises, Amanda invited Jacob to meet her briefly at a hotel. She called it convenience. She called it a place where they could talk uninterrupted. He came. They ate under low lights that made everything intimate by design. They spoke more than they should have. The narrative that followed in Jacob's mind was not a roar. It was a fog that assembled itself out of good intentions and the wrongness of a private tenderness. They shared a bed for a single implied hour, a thing the chorus of their lives would later name as transgression. Afterwards, Jacob walked back into the night with the weight of guilt folded into his chest like a secret he would carry like an extra child. Home became a place of small coldness. Miriam noticed the way Jacob's eyes retreated. Helen asked why her father smelled of hotel soap. Jacob mumbled, work. Miriam's suspicion steamed into the kitchen one afternoon. She cornered him with a broom as if seeking truth with the anger of a woman who had spent years being practical. Is there another woman? She asked, not because she wanted to hear the answer, but because she needed to draw any stray thing into the boundary of their life. Jacob's confession was halting. He did not speak of Amanda's age, nor did he speak of the golden card in his pocket. He admitted to an intimacy that felt like a betrayal, and watched Miriam's face change in a way that made him want to crawl into the oil-stained floor. She did not shout like a woman in a film. She folded herself into rage and disappointment that sounded like a closed door. The children watched. In that household, the echo of what was lost was dense. Amanda's life moved on its own axis. She felt a change, small, then insistent, like a tremor beneath the house. She took a test with the careful hands of a woman who had once been told that everything had been measured and found wanting. The result was a rupture of the ordinary, positive, 8 weeks. The ultrasound image was a small grayscale shock that turned a lifetime of planning into a new project, one that felt at once miraculous and terrifying. At 65, the news was a private thunder. Amanda wanted to hold the future close. She wanted to sink into the possibility of a child like a ship finding harbor. The joy it brought her was edged with a strange terror, medical improbability, the moral hazard of being celebrated by strangers and suspected by the ones closest to her.
She told Jacob in a voice that was almost giddy, and when he saw the ultrasound, his first reaction was not a measure of pride but panic. The image made the world tilt. He had been part of a night that could now produce a life. He felt the weight of that possibility pressed down on his chest. He did not tell Mariam at once. The secret became another debt he could not afford. At the workshop, he moved with hands that trembled. He avoided Amanda for a week, then returned because he felt unmoored anywhere else. Each visit made the secret heavier and the lines blurrier. He thought of Helen, who needed school fees and steady dinners, and of a life that might be transformed by an act he could not fully justify.
He was human in the way men are when faced with a chance to change the arithmetic of their family. He was tempted. Amaka watched this new development with the close scrutiny of someone who expects to lose. Her resentment, which had simmered into cautious comments and whispering barbs, boiled. She could see the practical implications. A baby meant a future claim on the estate. It meant legal priorities and public opinion leaning toward the mother's bloodline. She feared moving from the cozy seat of a favorite sister to the cold worry of a woman who would have to plead for crumbs. Amaka's motive was not a cartoon kind of greed. She had little savings beyond the invisible credit of being Amanda's sister. Emma and Chisholm were young men without visible prospect. Landlords and creditors could, at any call, make their lives thin. She had once tried to plan a small business that sank under its own debt. In the quiet of the night, she told herself she would not be left with nothing, that she could not bear the humiliation of begging for relevance in her 60s. Fear lent a sharpness to entitlement. Fear makes people clever in the worst ways. Amaka began to watch, to listen. She visited a market where old women sold remedies and spoke in low voices to men who dealt in things that were not measured in corporate minutes. She told herself she was searching for a way to protect her children. The people she spoke to were polite and vague. They did not offer instruction. They offered allusions and hints, like a net thrown in the water that promised to catch what one could not otherwise buy. It was in the small hours of an afternoon when Amaka's plan hardened. She sat with Emma and Chisholm in the back of the Okoro house and spoke with the flat cruelty of someone who had decided that survival justified sharp means. The boys listened, their faces as ordinary as any sons who had been taught to expect provision. Amaka leaned forward and said things that were not quite threats and not quite plans. She spoke of opportunities to remove obstacles quietly, of ensuring their house remained what it had been.
She insisted that Jacob's presence was an erosion, that his family might one day have legal standing, that a child could displace their claim like a storm washing away a dock. "I can make it right," she told them. "If we act now, quietly, it will be as if nothing happened." They wanted the house. They wanted the future. They wanted the permission not to be hungry. Amaka offered them a vision that would keep them safe. It was a forceful, moralless logic. If the child ceased to be, so too did the risk. They clapped hands over the idea like men agreeing to a small but necessary evil. She needed someone who could be pressed into service without drawing suspicion. Jacob was the obvious choice. He had been seen with Amanda. He had been envy medicine for the lonely woman. He had been paid. He had a family to protect. He was, in Amaka's estimation, a man who could be tempted to choose his blood over another woman's life. A week later, Amaka invited Jacob to meet her at a small roadside restaurant that smelled of frying oil and the boil of cassava. They sat by the window where the sun cut the air and made everyone seem sharper. Amaka ordered palm wine, not to drink, but because it made the room breathe with an older time, and she told Jacob that she admired him. She spoke of need without naming the need that came at the cost of another. She told a story of boards and of being kept out of the rooms where decisions were made. She spoke of gratitude with a blade hidden in the sugar. Jacob listened, restless. His life had been full of compromise. He had done work for people without being asked. Now, a woman whose hand had opened his fate was looking at him as if she might close it again. "I can help your family," Amaka said finally, and the sentence landed on Jacob like rain. She did not need to speak the rest. She tapped the table, and a small glass bottle was placed in front of him as if it were a cup of coffee. It was dark glass, little and familiar from other people's narratives. She pushed it toward him and opened her palm to show 2 thick envelopes. Inside, notes were stacked, the kind of money that solves immediate things. 3 million naira in folded bills, then another envelope with 6 months' rent paid in advance, and a promise that if Jacob did as she needed, he would be set. Jacob's pulse hit a tempo he had not felt since Helen's fever had spiked. 3 million naira could build a new life. It meant steady school fees, a run at a small business for Miriam, the kind of sleep that is not tentative. It would mean he could leave the workshop and live in a house with a door that locked, where hunger was not a presence at the table. The offers stacked themselves on the table like a new language, freedom measured in naira. Amaka's eyes were not cruel then, they were calculated. She looked like a woman who had had to practice the arithmetic of survival her whole life. "Think about your family, Jacob," she said.
You can give them everything they need. No one need know. He lifted his hand and felt the glass bottle cool against his palm. He did not look at what was inside, because the seeing was the thing that would change him. Instead, he thought of Helen, of Miriam, of the small life of 200,000 turned into 3 million. He thought of Amanda's ultrasound image,
a small gray thing that had become the fulcrum of 3 lives. Jacob left the restaurant with the notes in his pocket and the bottle's outline heavy in his mind. He did not walk immediately to his home. He sat on a bench under a tamarind tree and watched the traffic churn with a river that sometimes gave up coins. The sound of laughter and a hawker's call made the world go on as if nothing had shifted. He felt like a man who had one foot on either side of a cliff and had to choose which step to take. He thought of the golden card in his wallet, of Amanda's quiet gratitude, of the glow in her eyes when she had shown him a picture of a life that might have a child at its center. He thought of the smell of hot oil on Miriam's hands and the thinness of Helen's school shoes. He thought of how quickly a debt collects interest when the person you love is vulnerable. His phone vibrated. A message from Amanda. "How are you today? I dropped off a little something with Alhaji. Please tell Miriam thank you." There was a small heart at the end, the kind of punctuation that tried to make intimacy seem casual. He slid the phone into his pocket. He opened the envelope that Amaka had given him. Notes stared back like small, urgent promises. Jacob walked home heavier than he had left. The house was dark when he crept in. Helen slept with a blanket bunched under her chin. Miriam was at the stove, humming under her breath as if the domestic songs can stitch shame. Jacob thought of confessing. He thought of hiding. He thought of the arithmetic again and realized how brittle his moral logic could be when it was measured against his family's immediate need. Outside, Alhaji Musa had been watching the Okoro gate for weeks. He knew the house's small routines and its visitors. He noticed men who came and men who left with an ease that suggested there were corners in the house where things could be softened. He did not gossip, but he observed. In his pocket he carried a small key, a small knowledge. He would later tell a friend how he had seen Jacob once, with his head bowed, leaving the restaurant with more than his dignity. At home, Miriam asked nothing. She knew when a man's conscience shifted. She sat across from Jacob as he ate from a bowl of stew, and she watched him place the spoon down twice before he could find the words. Even when he tried to be honest and simple, the confession tumbled into an explanation that could not right itself. He did not tell her about the bottle. He did not tell her about the envelopes. He left both things like a pebble in his shoe.
That night he dreamed of 2 hands, one small and gray like an ultrasound, one strong and stained with oil. He woke with the taste of iron in his mouth. The next day he received another call, this time from a number that made his throat go dry before he answered. It was Amaka. "We need to speak," she said, and in those 3 words was a summons that felt like a court date. He was still thinking about the walk home when he saw her waiting at the corner of the market, her face arranged under a headscarf like a proclamation. She did not mention the envelopes. She did not mention the money. She only leaned close and reminded him, with the soft cruelty of a woman who believed she had been wronged, that some things are necessary. "Think of your daughter," she said again. "Think of sleep without worry." He thought of sleep without worry. He thought of the idea of running away. But running away was not a solution. It was an exile. He heard Amanda's voice in the back of his head. "We can take this slowly, Jacob. There is time." Time, a dangerous word when life is thin. He walked away with a heart that felt shredded between duty and desire. When he reached the workshop, he found a scrap of paper from his landlord at the gate. 2 months' rent due. The numbers were written in a hand that had lost patience. 120,000 naira. Jacob's hands clenched around the paper until his knuckles showed white under grime. He thought, if I take this money from Amaka, I could pay the rent and school and buy a small plot of land. But then he thought of the image of the ultrasound and the fact that a life was involved. He thought of moral lines and how they bent. He thought of his father's voice, long gone. A man must sleep in his conscience, Jacob. He tried to sleep in a conscience that was being pulled like a drumskin. By the time the day closed, the bottle sat in his chest like a stone. He had not opened it. He had not touched the envelopes. He had only held them as a man holds a promise he is not yet ready to break. He had seen the future as a weather map, clouds that might choose thunder. Outside the Okoro gate, Alhaji Musa closed the door and locked it, and the house swallowed its secrets. Inside, someone moved in the rooms and thought about the way life sometimes offers a second chance at a gift no one could have expected. The city beyond hummed, uncaring, but small human worlds were quietly busy rearranging themselves. Jacob lay awake that night, thinking of which life he would save, his family or the unknown child already claimed by an ultrasound image the size of a stamp. He felt himself leaning towards an impossible math. Perhaps there was a way to have both. He thought of lever and fulcrum and choices that make history for ordinary people. He did not yet know that his choice would become the axis of rumor, of suspicion, of accusation, that would demand everything he had.
When dawn came, the road outside the market was a ribbon of smoke and commerce.
Jacob walked with his head down, avoiding the eyes of those who had seen him with Amanda. People did see. Lagos is a place where everyone is in the business of noticing. A man with a gold card in his jacket will be noticed, and a man with envelopes in his pocket will be whispered about later. He tried to move like someone who had nothing to hide. At noon he was summoned by a voice that belonged to someone who dealt in power. Alhaji Musa had been told something, small talk at the gate, a neighbor's note, and now the driver asked Jacob to come to the back door of the Okoro house. Jacob's stomach turned. As he walked up the path, the marble had a different meaning. It was a surface that reflected choices now. Amaka met him by the fountain, hands folded in front of her like a woman who had been fasting and now planned her feast. She did not smile. She had a small purse hanging from her shoulder that made the faint clink of metal when she turned. She motioned him into an alcove where the sun could not watch easily, and she slid something across the stone ledge without looking at him. A small dark bottle, the sort of thing that made his throat close. It was not elaborate. It was like a relic of old solutions. Jacob's eyes darted to the bottle and then to Amaka's face. She did not speak for a long second. The garden seemed to hold its breath. "If you love your family," she said quietly, "you will do this. We will take care of you." Jacob put his palms on the marble and felt his fingers tremble. The bottle sat there like a small, obscene offering. He realized with terrible clarity how much his life could bend on this one hinge. He imagined handing it back, or taking it, or walking away and telling Amanda the truth, and watching the world fracture. He imagined Mariam's face if she saw the envelopes. He imagined Helen's laugh. He imagined a sea of consequences. He thought of the golden card in his wallet, of Amanda's hand when she had given him tea, of her laugh that now sounded like a bell calling a man to a choice. He thought of Amaka's eyes, small and hard. He closed his fist around the bottle's edge, and in that instant every person he loved crowded into the small space of his chest. The city thrummed around them. The marble caught the sun and blinked. Jacob did not yet take a breath that would decide the rest. He only stood there, the bottle cool and unlabeled in his fingers, and the world waiting like a judge with a slow pen. He stood there until the sun moved and the marble cooled, until the small dark bottle in his hand felt less like an object and more like a story someone else had written for him. He had not imagined his life shaped by glass and secrecy. The bottle weighed what guilt would weigh if guilt were something you could hold. He had known hunger. He had known the sharpness of a landlord's letter, the way a school note could flatten a man. He had not known how quickly a man could feel the ground tilt beneath the things he loved, how one difficult choice could begin to unmake a life. Jacob did not return to the Okoro house that afternoon. He walked the long way home, along roads that smelled of exhaust and roasting maize, past a line of men who sat telling the same stories every day. He kept the bottle wrapped in his shirt like contraband. He told himself the worst of the dreams would be washed away by sun and work. Instead, the dream darkened into a day that would not let go. Every time he thought of handing the bottle back, of telling someone, of throwing it into the lagoon and letting the city's tide decide, a ledger of needs rose and spoke in the exact voice of hunger. When he pushed open the tin door of his house, the heat inside felt like accusation. Miriam was at the stove, a cloth on her head, tending a pot that did not have the luxury of many spices. Helen sat near the doorway with a torn schoolbook and Ansel that had been chewed clean to the wood. For a heartbeat, Jacob saw them as the world always had been, small, steady, demanding of work. And then he saw them as a reason to answer in 1,000 complicated ways. "I have to tell you something," he said before he found any more delicate phrasing. The words fell like coins on the table, making a small sound that did not fit the confession. Miriam looked up. Her mouth was a straight line. She did not rise in surprise so much as in readiness. She had expected more surprises from him than the regular ones of rent and misfiled receipts. She set down the spoon and wiped her hands on the wrapper she used as a towel. "You come in late," she said. "You come with your head bowed like a man who has stolen. Speak." He told her about the restaurant, Amaka's offer, the envelopes, the bottle. He told her about the pull of 3 million naira, and how he had sat and learned that the arithmetic of necessity sometimes erodes the arithmetic of conscience. He told her about the ultrasound, the gray picture that had knocked a man half out of balance. He spoke in a steady voice,
a man making a case for himself in a court that had no judge. Miriam listened the way a woman who had held a family through sickness listens, with an economy of motion and a clear accounting of what the household could survive. She heard his confession and did not leap into melodrama. She folded it into her bones and made hard decisions with hands that had been used to mending and measure. "You took the envelopes?" she asked finally, not because she did not know, but because the detail needed to be named. "No," Jacob said. "I took them. I kept them. I didn't do what she wanted." Miriam's face became a map of ruin, and then, slower, of calculation. Her first motion was to deny it. He would be shouted at, driven out into the dust. Then to try to figure out management. "Why didn't you say no?" she asked. "Why did you not throw it away? Why did you not tell me?"
He had answers, and they were small. Fear, wanting, the lilt of hope in his chest he could not easily disentangle from the need to feed a child. He could not make his life fit the great moral syllogisms of a sermon. He had to make it work in naira and groceries. Miriam made him put everything on the table, the envelopes, the notes, 3 million naira that looked less like triumph than like a wound. The bottle he tucked into a paper wrapper and laid on the table like something to be examined. Helen watched with the stillness of children who know their father is in trouble but do not yet know the currency of shame. "You will not touch it again," Miriam said. "You will not let that woman touch us with her means." Her voice was not entirely harsh. It was the voice of someone who loved and feared, who had learned to keep the household's axis from wobbling. But there was also a slow anger building, not at Jacob alone, but at the world that made decisions like this feel necessary. "You should go," she added. "Go to her. Say you will tell her everything. Tell her what they ask you to do. See if she will be the woman she pretended to be." Jacob stared at her the way a man stares at a rough map and tries to divine a path. Telling Amanda meant exposing himself. It meant opening the door to scandal and suspicion in a way he had not planned. But not telling her meant living with the knowledge that someone was plotting against a life that had worth not measured in naira. He left with the bottles and the envelopes in his jacket, and with a small appetite to confront whatever would come. Miriam watched him go. She had not yet forgiven him. Forgiveness was work for later, perhaps after the dust had settled. Right now she needed to protect what she could. Helen, rent, dignity in the face of rumor. Amanda was at home when Jacob arrived. The Okoro house hummed with a different order of life. Staff who moved like a practiced ritual, a scent of citrus cleaner, the low, careful music that made money feel less like noise and more like a curated sound. Jacob felt like a man who had walked into a museum in his old shoes. He waited under the eaves while Alhaji found a way to bring him in, and when he met Amanda in the drawing room, he saw the surprise soften into concern in her face. He told her everything. He did not try to dress it up. He did not hide the envelope on the table. He put it there between them like a proof. He set the bottle down and watched her eyes travel across its small darkness. Amanda listened as she had when she had first invited him for tea, patient, problem-solving, but now there was something harder in her gaze. The pregnancy had given her a tenderness she had never known how to hold. The idea that someone would try to take that away from her made that tenderness crystallize into a different currency, a sharpness of grief and a readiness for retribution. "I do not believe you are a murderer," she said when he had finished.
"But I believe you were tempted." Jacob felt the shame like a rope around his chest. "I did not go all the way," he said. "I did not—" "You could have," Amanda interrupted gently. "I also know that sometimes men do things to survive that later make them smaller." She looked at him as if cataloging the human condition. "You brought me this because you could not bear to carry it alone." He had brought the bottle because he could not think of a lesser humiliation than admitting a sister of the house wanted a life to be removed. He had brought the money because his wife had demanded he tell the truth. Part confession, part calculation. Amanda rose slowly from the sofa. She moved with the soft authority of a woman who had been running companies and appointments for decades. She took the bottle in her hand and examined it with eyes that were not inexperienced with objects people use to alter fate. She did not need to know what was inside. The presence of an intent was enough. "Who else knows?" she asked. "Amaka, her boys," Jacob said. "Maybe others at the restaurant." "Why would she do this?" Amanda asked, more to herself than to him. "Because she is afraid of losing the little she has," Jacob said. "Because to Amaka, a child is a threat. She is not a bad woman. She is scared." Amanda sat back and let out the kind of breath that had been hoarded for years.
The house felt smaller now, like a field that had been salted. She called for Amaka. The twin arrived with the little rustle of someone who has always believed she held better cards than anyone else. For a moment, the two sisters faced each other like two halves of a life, and the distance between them was a public thing to be measured. Amanda set the bottle on the table between them and did not let her voice climb to the pitch of accusation. "Why?" she asked simply. Amaka tried to answer with something that sounded like defense, like the first part of a practice story. She spoke of dependence and fear, of the death that life had become, of Emma and Shisam and a future she could not see if this child arrived. At first, she tried to manage it as a negotiation. We keep what we are owed. We make sure the house is protected. But there is a place where rhetoric runs thin. Amanda watched her twin and saw the small fissures of panic form, the quickness with which Amaka's eyes shifted, the way her hands flexed a rhythm of remorse. "I did not order a crime," Amaka said finally, and in those words she attempted to deny the logic that had her at its center. Her voice cracked. "I only thought to keep what was mine." Amanda pressed a single, terrible question. "Did you give this to him?" Amaka's answer was neither immediate nor forceful. She swallowed, and then, like someone surrendering to an inevitable tide, she admitted the truth. She had offered the bottle and the envelopes.
She had thought to make the problem disappear before it became glaring, before the law and the public eye could change the calculus of who would be the rightful heir to her sister's attention. She had expected cunning, not confession. She had expected things to remain private and small. The confession was a sound like an unlatching. It made the living room suddenly material. The housekeeper with a dishcloth frozen mid-air, Al-Haji's jaw set, and Jacob sitting like a man who had walked himself into a room where everything possible might finally be said out loud. Amanda's reaction was not theatrical. She did not scream. She simply rose and walked to Amaka, as if placing a hand on the shoulder of someone fragile and dangerous at once. The house they had both inhabited, different in ways that were sometimes invisible and sometimes cruel, felt to Amanda like a ship that had been repaired with poor nails. "You wanted to protect what you had," Amanda said. "You wanted to be sure." She looked at Jacob, then back to Amaka. "You have chosen the worst way." Amaka's face cracked open, and with it came a human reckoning. She told them of nights of worry, of calls unanswered by men who promised loans and did not follow through, of the small humiliation of asking for change and being answered by pity. She confessed not just to plotting, but to the logic that had justified the plot to herself. It was a confession that did not absolve, but it did make clear that behind her decision was fear, not simple malice. Amanda listened and then did something that surprised no one and stunned everyone. She expelled Amaka and her sons from the house, not with a shriek, but with a quiet severing, a change in the household ledger. She told her twin she could still survive, that she would be given a small allowance to leave with, but that she would not be able to stay and cohabit the life she had built out of Amanda's generosity. "You will go," Amanda said. "You will take what you need to make yourself independent. You will not remain a parasite in my house. This is not mercy. This is justice." Her voice trembled once and then steadied. Amaka argued that it was unfair. She argued that family required reciprocity. But Amanda had decided. The house's doors were closed to him and his sons. The staff began to pack some of Amaka's small things, her jewelry box, a painting she had loved, and the air in the household changed into the speed of something that had been planned in secret and now found sunlight. Word moved faster than the sisters. Lagos feeds on rumor and calls it news. By evening, the story had become a sting in the neighborhood, that someone had tried to harm Amanda and that a mechanic had been involved. The fact that Jacob had been seen with envelopes, that he had been to the restaurant with Amaka, that he had lived with a scandal in the making, made him an easy figure for suspicion. Facts were messy. Rumor preferred a straight line.
At the workshop, men began to look at him differently. There was a whisper. Did he accept money? Did he do as Amaka asked? A small crowd gathered one evening, not many, but enough to make the air taste like fear. Someone claimed they had seen him at the restaurant with a small dark bottle. Someone else said Al-Haji had seen him leave with envelopes. The story congealed into an accusation that did not yet have evidence, but had motive. Jacob had been near Amanda and had been paid.
People like neat narratives. This was neat. Mariam suffered the social recoil the way the poor always do, in quiet cuts. A neighbor came by with eyes full of soft judgment and said a prayer too loud. The landlord called more often with a sharper tone. The school demanded fees. The world zipped into the small angles that make the lives of the poor taut. Jacob saw it all and felt small and furious, not at Mariam, but at the system that made a man's act of survival into a public sin, at the way rumor lashed out. He thought of going to the police to make a statement, but he also thought of how police questions could unfold into things he did not want to say aloud. The hotel night, the envelopes, the bottle. He had saved the pregnancy, but would he also save his reputation? It felt unlikely. There was a moment, just before the household packed to leave, when Jacob considered, again, the envelopes. He could take them and run straight away. With 3 million naira, he could disappear into a town where no one had seen him take course from a billionaire. He could buy a plot, build a small structure, and give Helen a school that would not ask for payment every month. But running felt like a kind of theft, not only from the house, but from something larger, the truth. He went back to Amanda and laid it bare. The envelopes, the bottle, the way Amaka had tried to use his need as a lever to remove a life. He gave her the money and asked her to do what she needed to do. "I do not want it," he said. "Keep it. Use it for the child. Use it for whatever you choose." Amanda looked at the cash and then at him. "You cannot wash a thing with money and think you are clean," she said, "but you can choose to make amends." She took the money and placed it in a box marked for hospital expenses. She said she would not press criminal charges against him if he told her everything he knew. "Tell me who else," she said. "Tell me where it started." Jacob told her everything he knew. About Amaka's fear, about the conversation at the restaurant, about the bottle being left with him at the alcove by the fountain. He could not unmake his part in any of it, and he did not try. He offered Amanda the truth, because the truth was the only currency he now felt had value. For the household, the truth was a jagged thing to be managed. Amanda's expulsion of Amaka and her sons created a scandal that rippled out. Men from the neighborhood who knew the Okoro house as a place of reliable gossip fed the story to others.
Someone told a journalist. Someone else posted a short account that made the mechanics of the plot sound fearfully neat. A bottle, a bribe, a poor mechanic. In the apron of an afternoon, Jacob's name was on people's tongues in a way that suggested guilt. He was not arrested. There were no men in suits at his door that night. But suspicion is a shape that holds weight. People looked at him and saw possibility of complicity. Amanda's staff, forced into loyalty, murmured about what he might have done. Mariam retreated into a silence that was both a shield and a wound. They decided to leave Lagos for a time. It was not running as much as putting distance between themselves and the place where rumor had become a prosecution without formalities. The money that had been meant to buy murder turned into their ticket away. A bus ticket to Abeokuta, a small deposit for a room by the main market, a promise of a neighbor who would take them in for a season. Mariam packed what little they could carry, and Helen placed her school book into a plastic bag, as if books could be talismans. Jacob felt like a man who had survived a fight with no winners. Before they left, the neighborhood held a small court at the compound gate. Men who had watched Jacob grow as a mechanic, and women who had seen Mariam feed her children with discipline, assembled with folded arms. Mariam stood before them, and in a voice that had been carved by responsibility, told them what had been done and what they had chosen: humiliation and exile for a season, but no crime confessed, and a choice to leave in order to keep their daughter safe. People murmured, and some were merciless. A neighbor pointed at Jacob, not with vengeful force, but with the mechanical cruelty of judgment. "You brought this shame to our gate," he said. "You sit with the rich and come home with something to hide." It was not shouted like in a film, but measured like a community dispensing a sentence: social exile. The shame was public because in Lagos, small circles expand in a way that turns private shame into common concern. Jacob felt the weight of that accusation in a way the law never could have measured. They left at dawn, with the city clouded in a heat that made everything smudge. Jacob watched as the Okoro house receded into the distance of a life he had touched and broken in ways he wanted to explain but could not. He clutched Mariam's hand as if it were an anchor. In Abeokuta, the air was cooler, and for a while anonymity soothed. They found a room above a small shop, and Jacob took work where he could, fixing generators, lending hands in a mechanic's yard that was smaller and less pretentious than the one he had left. He sent money to the landlord and bought schoolbooks for Helen. He tried to live simply, to make the weight of guilt bearable by working small and steady tasks. But news is a thing that travels.
Amanda's expulsion of Amaka made headlines in the kind of small papers that preferred human drama to policy.
People discussed the audacity of a woman at 65 becoming pregnant and then having her twin try to remove that possibility. They debated who had the greater sin, the sister who sat in the house complaining of being owed, or the man who took the envelopes and found mercy later. Many agreed the mechanic had been foolish, some declared him guilty. Rumor hardened into reputation. One evening, as Jacob sat on a bench mending a generator starter coil, two men in plain clothes came to the yard. They did not handcuff him. They asked questions in a patient way and then in a more precise way. They wanted to know where he had been the day certain envelopes were exchanged. They wanted to know whether he had ever been in a room with a small bottle. Jacob answered honestly and then stopped short of volunteer testimonies no one had asked for. He knew his truth and the way it might be used. "You were seen taking money from Amaka," one man said. "You were seen at the hotel. We have statements." "I took the money," Jacob said, "but I did not use the bottle. If I had used it, I would have meant to be paid. I did not." The men wrote the words down and took Jacob's details. It was not the arrest he feared. It was the continuation of being a character in someone else's story. When they left, the yard felt colder. He had been suspected, and being suspected in a city that prefers clean narratives is almost its own punishment. Amanda's house, meanwhile, rearranged itself in a way that was noiseless and decisive. She cut the ties that had allowed her twins' dependence to become an entitlement. She gave the money Amaka had stockpiled for the house's servants to a communal fund for employees who had long been asked to hold their own months together with borrowed faith. She sat in a room that used to be silent and let it be silent in a different way, surer, resolved. The pregnancy progressed, and with each week Amanda lived with a careful, anxiously tender watchfulness. She visited doctors and trusted the professionals' discretion. She guarded the news because the world, now that it had heard of the attempt, would both pity and exploit her. She hired extra security. She spoke softly to the baby, whole sentences that had nothing to do with her fortune and everything to do with the new shape of her life. On a dull evening, with rain painting the windows like a wash of time, she pulled out a small photograph that had been taken in a busier time, a young woman in a skirt on a university path, a photograph that used to be kept in a drawer. She thought of all the small decisions that had brought her here, marriages that had grown cold, a life of career focus, the quiet adoption of distance from her own. The pregnancy had become not only a miracle, but a challenge. How to raise a child in a world that measured worth in different currencies than she did now.
She thought of Jacob. She would not flatten his sin into a headline. She felt sympathy, but also recognition that proximity to wealth had changed him. He had been tempted. He had been human. When the newspapers called him the suspect, she felt the ugliness of that label, as if it had been a personal cut. She knew enough about class and narrative to know where the finger would point. The poor man who had blood in his house would always be easier to frame than the woman who lived in marble. She had the right and power to name the truth and to protect someone who had told it. But she also understood that names stick in public memory, regardless of correction. Amanda wrote a note and sent it to Jacob with Alhaji. "If you come, I will speak to the police. I want truth, not rumor." She meant the note to be a bridge, not a trap. Jacob received the message in Abeokuta and let it sit on the table for a long time. He read it again and again, and in its quiet lines he felt both accusation and the possibility of clearing his name. He went back to Lagos. He rode a bus that hissed through potholes and dust, feeling smaller by degrees. He arrived with a chest that was stone and walked into the Okoro house with Miriam and Helen at his side, because they had chosen to meet whatever judgment there would be as a family. Amanda greeted them in a way that was neither warm nor cold, just resolute. She sat them down, and in a voice that had been used to chair in meetings, she asked him again to tell everything. He told her everything, about the restaurant, about the envelopes, about the bottle, about his weakness and the way he had thought to use the money to run away. He told her about Miriam's face when he had confessed. He told her about his children. When he finished, there was a kind of silence that felt like a country holding its breath. Amanda considered all of it, and then, in a voice that did not have the collapse of a woman who had been hurt, but the clarity of a woman who had been injured and had thoughts left, she said what would shape much of what came after. "You walked away from doing the worst thing, but men in your position are vulnerable. You must live with that." In the days that followed, Amanda confronted Amaka in a more public way. She called a small gathering and made the household hear the truth. Amaka's sons were expelled with their mother. They left with a small suitcase and a kind of stunned shame that looked like the first rags of accountability. The household acted like a court with the simplest verdict: exile.
There would be no dramatic show trial. There would be a moral dismantling of a life built on privilege. Still, even with Amaka forced from the house and with Jacob's confession in hand, the world had lodged the image of him holding envelopes deep in its memory. He was suspected because he had been tempted, and because rumor prefers the poor as culprits when guilt needs a face.
Friends who had once nodded to him across the street now turned away. Church members whispered. The story hardened into the single line that people repeated over and over. They tried to end the 65-year-old billionaire's pregnancy, and the poor mechanic was suspect. Amanda, for all her clarified moral stance, could not erase the world's appetite for gossip, nor could she control the curiosity that wanted finality. She did, however, make a choice that would remain one of the more important moments of her days. She chose to keep the child, and she chose to raise it within a moral perimeter that had been tested and chastened. She would not be alone, she said to herself, because she had staff who respected true accountability and friends who helped where empathy was required. Jacob and his family did not return to the workshop as though nothing had happened. They kept a low profile for a long while. Jacob found the way to do honest labor again. He taught Helen to be careful with shoes and books, and to bank kindness in a world that could be unkind. Miriam, who could not entirely forgive but who could survive, learned the exact ledger of practicality: how much food would feed their family a week, which neighbor could loan a small thing, which town could keep their name free from gossip for a season. But something else lurked in Jacob, some memory of what it felt like to be both wanted and suspect, to be the kind of man who could be bought and later called a villain. He found himself watching how Amanda moved through the world with a careful sadness that sometimes softened into humor. He would not be rehabilitated in the public eye by charity alone. He would have to do the long work of regaining trust, of living in such a way that his choice came to be seen as a pattern rather than an accident. In the months that followed, life rearranged around new facts. Amaka and her sons were seen leaving the city with little more than the small wages some kind neighbors could rustle for them. They disappeared into the margins where a new life might be sown, or where their old habits might be difficult to change. None of them were portrayed as cartoon villains. They were human beings placed into desperate choices and making the worst of them. Amanda prepared for motherhood with a sort of hard grace. She bought nothing superfluous but insisted on medical attention and a plan, not because she feared the medical texts, but because she wanted the best in a world that often mistook wealth for safety. She was in the paper sometimes, the curious, the sympathetic, the unbelieving. People wanted to know the truth about how a woman at 65 could be pregnant. They wanted scandal and they wanted miracle. They were content with both, in parts. Jacob, in his way, grew used to the nickname of suspect. He knew it would follow him like dust.
But he kept the small things that had survived: Helen's laugh, Mariam's steady hands, the work of turning a life into a life that could be loved. He visited the Okoro house only when Amanda asked him, once to help fix a faulty generator, once to bring a small gift of school books. He was not the man who had wanted to buy escape. He had become the man who worked for small redemption. There was a legal report in a local paper that spoke of the attempted interference with Amanda's pregnancy, and it used language like investigation ongoing. That was the kind of phrase that the law liked, a suspended note that promised later correction. But in the court of public opinion, the story had already been tried. Jacob's face, along with the other names, had been placed into a narrative sketch that suited people's appetite for simplicity. He did not contest the shorthand. He could not fight all the small wars against rumor. He chose instead to do the longer work of goodness. In the end, Amanda stood at a window in her home one dusk, the city sliding into its nightly lit-up grit, and she placed a small ultrasound picture near the glass. She thought about the way the world had tried to remove the possibility of new life from her, and how she had responded. The expulsion of Amaka had been bitter. The suspicion of Jacob had been ugly. But she had the image and a quiet hope. She had also learned to hold consequences without being corroded by them. She had been forced into taking stock of what family meant beyond blood and beyond the convenience of always being taken care of. What will happen to the child, she wondered aloud, to herself, because at her core the question was the hinge. Will history's gossip follow the baby like an imprint? Will Amanda be able to teach a child the difference between being wanted and being used? She had no tidy answer. Her life had never offered tidy answers. Jacob, in a small room above a shop in Abeokuta, watched rain beat against a corrugated roof and thought of those same questions in another key. Would his children grow up with a father who had been marked by a story not entirely of his making?
Would Helen stare at the headlines the way children sometimes do and learn to cover their shame with pride? He promised himself small things: to be present, to be honest, to be a man Mariam could trust again. There remained the moral residue of suspicion and of mistakes. There remained Amaka and her sons in a liminal place between outdoors and opportunity. There remained questions that had not been answered. Would Jacob ever return to his old life? Would Amanda's child arrive in a world willing to see its origin and its whole story? Would Amaka learn something other than how to survive on someone else's terms? They had tried to end the pregnancy of a 65-year-old woman because fear had become a maneuver.
They had brought a poor mechanic into the center of the scheme because his poverty made him pliable in the harsh arithmetic of dependency. They had thought in terms of small trades: a bottle, an envelope, a silence. What they had not accounted for was human stubbornness, a wife who would not be bought off into silence, a billionaire who would respond with a moral clarity she had long forgotten she had, and a mechanic who, flawed and tempted and guilty, nonetheless chose a path that saved a life. The city continued to judge. People still said in bars and at market stalls, he was the suspect, was he not? The phrase lingered like the aftertaste of bad coffee. But in the private rooms of those involved, the story was fuller and more human. A wife who forgave in increments, a woman who lost her sister and gained an understanding of what generosity must not look like, a man who left and worked and tried to stitch up shame with small patience. At night, Amanda would sometimes press her hand against the soft roundness of her belly and speak. She spoke of the future as if it were a person to be introduced gently into the world. She would say sometimes, "You are wanted," and sometimes repeat, "We will do better." The clarity of her voice in a house that had seen betrayal mattered. It was a moral rehearsal. Jacob, watching Helen sleeping under a blanket patched at the corner, promised himself a different kind of witness. He would be the man who paid back in steadiness, who refused quick fixes, who taught his daughter to hold her dignity like a small, stubborn thing no one could buy. The city might label him suspect, but his nights were for conscience and for the small steps of a life lived on the right side of kindness as he now understood it. And Amanda, alone in a house she had once thought too large, learned to measure power in ways other than ownership. The marble floors could not protect against human envy, nor could money buy away the ache of betrayal. But she had made a choice. She had chosen to keep life. She had chosen to expel the person who had sought to buy her future away. She had chosen to receive the truth from someone who had been tempted, and in doing so had created a space where a man could step back into his life with a small dignity. The title of what happened, "They Try to End the 65-year-old Billionaire's Pregnancy, and the Poor Mechanic is Suspect," was a sentence that held an entire city's appetite for drama. It told the headline truth, but it did not tell the whole human story, of fear, of dependence, of temptation, of small acts of quiet redemption. It made people choose sides easily, but the people who lived inside it understood the complexity. Months later, with the rains lighter and the road to Abeokuta less dusty, Jacob received a letter in the mail. It was from Amanda. Inside was a small envelope, a photograph of an invitation to a christening written in a hand that was careful and slightly smiling.
She had not forgotten him. She had not named his guilt. She had only asked if he would be there as a courtesy to the child, whose life should not be held hostage to rumor. Jacob folded the invitation and set it on the table in the small room they now rented. He looked at Mariam, and she looked back with a softness that had re-emerged like green after a long dry season. They were poor, and they were scarred, and the suspicion would follow him as long as the world wanted it. But there was a possibility now, not of clearing all things, but of living in a way that would make some of the noise settle. Amanda's house remained under a watch that was at once protective and wary. She moved forward with a quiet stubbornness that would be the defining shape of the months to come. She had been betrayed, and she had been hurt, but she was not broken. She was pregnant at 65, and she had chosen to make of that chance a responsibility to the future. The questions that remained: will Jacob return fully to a life where he is not defined by suspicion? Will Amaka and her sons find a path away from dependence? How will the child be raised, and will the city's appetite for scandal be quieter than its appetite for miracle, hung in the air like a string of rain beads on a palm leaf? They were unresolved, messy, human. They had tried to end the pregnancy. They had pointed a finger and called a poor mechanic suspect. But in the quiet rooms where people lived and loved, where decisions are made in the currency of small kindness and stubborn regret, a different truth held. People are complicated, motives are tangled, and sometimes redemption wears the simple clothes of work and apology,
and the slow, steady effort to be better. If you want to follow what happens next, to see whether Jacob can rebuild a name that rumor has stained, whether Amanda's child will be raised in a house that learned its lesson, whether Amaka's exile will become the making of a new life, subscribe and come back for the next chapter.